Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 6 of the Magical Misfits. We are getting ready what's going to find out and if Carter is going to join or not. The next morning, Carter woke up on the bench in the front of the town hall where he spent the night. Someone had covered him in a bristly old blanket. He felt for his bag across his chest. Still there, thank goodness. His vision spun as he took in the park across the street if to see if anyone might be watching him. Its crisp green grass reached out for several blocks in either direction. A grand-looking white gazebo stood directly in the center of the lawn. Quaint, colorful buildings lined the streets that surrounded the park. Whimsical wooden signs hung over doors and shops that weren't yet open. There was one shaped like a tall boot, another like a striped piece of red and white candy, and another was an old-fashioned silver key. The area was empty except for a few well-dressed people out for a morning stroll, and no one looked in his direction. He was relieved to see the sun. Not having a home was always the hardest when it was raining. Carter got up, stretched, then peed behind some bushes. Something jingled inside his pants pocket. Reaching inside, Carter pulled out several coins. They must have come from the same person who covered him with the blanket. But who? Then he remembered. The circus crew. They probably followed him and were trying to convince him to join them. Unsure who gave him the blanket, Carter folded it and stashed it beneath the bench in case he needed it again that night. He was about to throw away a bee-shaped pretzel from the previous night, but then he thought better of it and tore it into pieces, sharing most of it with a crowd of pigeons before taking a few bites for himself. At least some good came out of that horrible man. Without Uncle Sly making the daily decisions, Carter wasn't sure what to do next. He could choose his own fate. Should he leave the town or stay? He had no idea. Should he join Bosso's crime circus? Absolutely not. Should he search for Mr. Vernon? Where would he start? He took Vernon's ace card out of his sleeve and flipped it over in his hand. It was an ordinary card, but examining it closer, he noticed the tiniest crease. He held it up to the sunlight. Sure enough, there was almost a faded fold down the center. He opened the crease and found that the ace of spades became a jack of diamonds, except the image of the jack was holding a business card in his hand and an address on it, 1313 Main Street. Whoa, Carter whispered. A warm feeling rose in his chest. It was an unfamiliar sensation. It made him feel awkward and vulnerable, so he tried to push it down. Perhaps Mr. Vernon would turn out to be a nice guy. But he could just as easily turn out to be as bad as Bosso or his uncle. Either way, Carter wouldn't get his hopes up. Carter circled the small park, found Main Street, and then followed the numbers until he reached a small shop tucked between two taller office buildings. The signs over the door were shaped like a top hat. The hand-painted letters on the glass window read, Vernon's Magic Shop, purveyors of the impossible. When Carter entered, a tiny bell on the door rang out loud. A green feathered parrot with a yellow neck squawked. Hello, Carter. Welcome to Vernon's Magic Shop. How did the bird know my name? Carter asked, astounded. Magic, of course, said a large-eyed girl sitting on the counter. She wore a white jacket with straps that tied her arms behind her back. There's no such thing as magic, Carter said, recalling this same conversation he'd had with Mr. Vernon the previous night. But as he looked around the shop, he felt something hopeful stir inside. The two-story shop's walls were covered floor to ceiling with bookshelves and autographed black and white photos of famous magicians. Every face was cluttered with magical items of every sort. Crystal balls, decks of cards, top hats, wands, capes, and even a human skull. A wooden staircase curved up toward a small balcony, where there sat a small wooden table with two leather chairs. The table was empty except for a chessboard mid-game. Carter felt like a kid in a candy store, except hungrier. Well, not as hungry as the other night prior. His gaze swept over the towering shelves, packed with alphabetical boxes labeled with things like fingertips, flash paper, fog, and fool's glass. He wanted to ask what it was all for, but he felt embarrassed. So he promised himself the next time he found a library, he'd look these things up. There were bouquets of rainbow, feather flowers, jars filled with marbles, and all sizes, a ventriloquist dummy in a tuxedo and a cape, very much like Mr. Vernon's from the night before. Even a white rabbit hopping across the floor. So you're Carter, the girl said. Yes, Carter answered uncomfortably. He didn't like strangers knowing his name. Do you need help getting out of that? My straitjacket? No thanks. I've got this. But do me a favor and count to 5. 1, 2, 3. Forget it, I'm out, she cried, shaking the jacket off. Underneath, she wore a form-fitting black shirt and pants. She hopped down from the counter, walked confidently over to Carter, and extended her hand. My name is Layla the Great, escape artist extraordinaire. Nice to meet you, Carter. Brown irises sparkled with flecks of amber in her eyes. Her wavy dark hair draped to the nape of her neck and bounced whenever she moved her head. Were you expecting me? Carter mumbled, taken aback. Nope, my dad was, Layla said. Who's your dad? Well, that would be me, a voice said from behind. I believe we've met already. Startled, Carter nearly jumped through the window. A moment before, he and Layla and the parrot had all been alone in the shop. He was certain of it. Mr. Vernon, Carter said. Where'd you come from? Here and there, Mr. Vernon said, avoiding the question. I see you found the store. So I was right. You were selling something, Carter said, motioning to the store. No one does magic just for fun. I do, Layla pronounced. Mr. Vernon shook his head. I wasn't trying to sell you anything, Carter. On the contrary, I simply recognized a kindred spirit and shared something that brought a smile to your face. That's hardly a crime, is it? Carter's cheeks flushed as he remembered the kindness that the old man had shown him at Bosso's carnival. Still, he couldn't bring himself to say thanks for warning him about Bosso, at least not in front of the girl. He was sure that she didn't need to know about his predicament. Mr. Vernon placed his hand over a stack of business cards and made one flutter across the counter. It floated off the surface and danced on the air. A moment later, the card dropped into his hand. Carter felt the excitement stir in his stomach. It was an unfamiliar feeling. He found himself craving more. How'd you do that? Magic, Mr. Vernon said simply. There's no, Carter started. Such thing, Mr. Vernon finished for him. Yes, you've said as much. I respectfully disagree. Look around you. I've tried to create a sense of wonder for those who step across my threshold. Do you not feel it? Carter did feel it, but it made him uncomfortable that this stranger could read him like a book. Nodding, Layla piped up. I saw his face when he walked through the door. He definitely feels the wonder. Carter crossed his arms and pursed his lips. Still, with the gruff demeanor and dark outlook, I see, Mr. Vernon said. Very well, not everyone needed to be cheerful all the time. Magic accepts all kinds. I'm happy you're here. I was just telling my daughter about you. How are you two related? You don't look anything alike, Carter noted. Layla's golden-hued complexion suddenly turned pink. Carter immediately wished he could take the words back. He hadn't meant to embarrass anyone. Families come in all different shapes and sizes, Mr. Vernon commented as he pulled a feather duster out of nowhere and began cleaning a shelf that didn't need to be cleaning, like a snowflake or a thumbprint. No two alike. Plus, I'm adopted, Layla clarified with a grin. She pulled a pair of handcuffs out from the counter and locked them onto her own wrists. But I was rather lucky ending up with someone who understands my need to escape. I was good at it before, but since I came here, my dad's taught me all sorts of better ways to get better. Luck, don't you mean magic? Mr. Vernon smiled, tugging at Layla's handcuffs to show they were on securely. I prefer to think of it as fate, Layla reasoned. A spark woke of Carter's fate. Fate. That's what he felt had brought him to this town, too. He sensed it while he was climbing onto the roof of the chime car, and it had only grown as his uncle disappeared into the distance. Layla walked over to Carter and clapped her hands. When Carter looked down, the handcuffs were on his wrist. How'd you do that? Carter asked. He knew plenty of tricks, but already he could tell these people were experts compared to him. Escape artist, Layla said in a pointed whisper. Remember? The tiny bell on the door rang, and a bearded man with dark eyes and a handsome smile entered. The parrot squawked, repeating, Hello, Carter. Welcome to Mr. Vernon's magic shop. Carter laughed. So it wasn't magic. You just taught the bird to say that to everyone who walked in today. Mr. Vernon shrugged, trying to laugh. Did I? Hello, Carter, the other man said. I'm Mr. Vernon. Carter looked from Mr. Vernon to the second Mr. Vernon. They looked nothing alike either. The second Mr. Vernon had several inches shorter than his counterpart and wore glasses. His trim beard covered the bottom half of his face, which shone in the morning light and streamed through the shop windows. He was dressed in a stained white jacket that had 2 rows of shiny buttons running up the front, and his pants were checkered black and white. Seeing Carter's confusion, Layla explained, I have two dads. She rose over to the new man and kissed him on his cheek. Hi, Papa. I don't even have one parent, Carter said. You're lucky. You can call me the other Mr. Vernon. You can call me the other Mr. Vernon, Layla's second dad said to Carter. Everyone does, well, except for Layla here. I don't do magic except in the kitchen. You make food disappear, Carter said. No, he's a cook. I'm the one who makes food disappear, Layla said, rubbing her stomach. He's not simply a cook, Mr. Vernon noted. He's the head chef of the Grand Oak Resort. You might have noticed it overlooking our town. It's a beautiful resort, usually, the other Mr. Vernon explained. Ever since that B.B. Basso and his crew checked in, they've been making an absolute mess of everything, demanding food when the kitchen is closed, raiding the pantries after hours, behaving like beasts. Those vagabonds are absolute animals. Carter cringed at the word vagabond, which means a person who wanders from place to place without a home or a job. Carter had been called a vagabond several times. Mr. Vernon threw a harsh glance at the other Mr. Vernon, then quickly added, Carter, did you know that the famous illusionist P.T. Sabelt grew up without a roof over his head? They say it gave him the drive to become a successful magician. The other Mr. Vernon ducked behind the counter, scanning the area. Apologies, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I forgot my key. Where is that thing? Is this it? Layla said, holding up a key at the center of a series of knots and bound rope. Would you mind? The other Mr. Vernon asked, pulling his hat out. Layla, in less than 2 seconds, unknotted the ropes, placed the key in her father's hand. She kept the rope herself. Carter couldn't believe his eyes. Her hands were over as fast as his own. Thank you very much, the other Mr. Vernon said, and he kissed his daughter on the forehead and waved politely to Carter as he stepped outside. Nice to meet you. Oh, this rope gives me an idea for a trick I'd like to practice, Layla smiled. Brilliant, but perhaps after school, Mr. Vernon said. Shouldn't you be on your way, young lady? Layla's confident smile slipped into a frown. Carter's not on his way to school. Well, then it's a good thing you're not Carter. I'm between schools right now, Carter blurted out. Thankfully, Layla ignored this. May I take the day off? She asked her father. A day off from school, Mr. Vernon raised a pointy white eyebrow. Whatever for, my darling daughter. It's been a tough week. The other kids, Layla said quietly, they just don't understand me. If you can escape a straitjacket, Mr. Vernon said, I'm sure you can find some way to impress one or two of your classmates. And if not, just tie them to their chairs. Believe it or not, most kids don't like hearing about how to escape, Layla explained. That's the problem. I offer to show them how it works, but none of the girls will let me sit with them at lunch. And the boys, they just laugh at me in the hallways and call me freak. Freak, Uncle Vernon said, appalled. Maybe chivalry is dead. Layla rolled her eyes. Don't you mean chivalry is dumb? You could always try disappearing instead, said Carter. That helped me get out of a ton of predicaments. Layla laughed. Well, I am in a predicament, sighing, she said. I'll give it a shot. And she walked over to her dad and hugged him. She passed Carter. She stuck her hand out and said, Pleasure to meet you. See you soon? Carter shook his head. I hope so. Then Carter and Mr. Vernon were alone. Mr. Vernon continued to dust his totally clean shop. Without looking, he asked, Tell me, Carter, how was the remainder of your evening? Uneventful, I hope? Basso tried to get me to join his gang, Carter admitted. I said no. Brilliant. How did you know he was going to ask me? Carter wondered out loud. I didn't know, Mr. Vernon said, but I had a strong hunch. B.B. Basso is a greedy man. He also is something of a collector. You've got some skills that would make fine addition to any collection. Carter put his hands in his pocket. You obviously don't know me very well. Nonsense. You are a young man with great intelligence, and even greater common sense, and an honorable code for living. No matter where we live or how much we have, those are the most important things. You have quite the talent with your fast hands. In my entire career as a magician, I've only seen one other person with such nimble fingers. Carter was stunned into silence. Did Mr. Vernon know he was homeless and poor, or was he guessing? Carter felt undeserving of such compliments. He wondered already if Mr. Vernon was the one who'd left the blanket. But how could Carter ask him without revealing the truth of his situation? You're wrong, Carter whispered. I'm he tried to find the right word. Basso had used the previous night. A misfit. Aren't we all misfits in some way or other? Mr. Vernon called out, suddenly upstairs, looking over the balcony. How'd you? Carter gasped. Mr. Vernon took a book off a shelf and dropped it down to Carter. The old orange cloth cover was embossed with black lettering, Vanishing and Unvanishing by Bailey and Barnes. What is this? Carter asked, cracking open his cover and flipping through the first few pages. It's slim enough to fit nicely in his bag, and yet... Homework, Mr. Vernon said. Read it. I suspect you'll appreciate it. I don't have any money. Consider it a gift, Mr. Vernon said with a toss of his hand, from one magician to another. I'm not a magician, Carter said, his voice trembling. I just do tricks. Then you don't see what I see, Mr. Vernon said, and seeing is believing, as the saying goes. The man hurried down the stairs and grabbed his cape and top hat off their hooks off the wall. He led Carter toward the door. Unfortunately, I have a terribly busy day and need to close the shop while I see about a few things around town. But you should come back, say about 4 o'clock? Sure, I can do that, Carter said, confused. He was both grateful for the gift and surprised to be getting kicked out after such a short talk. Brilliant, Mr. Vernon said, pushing him out the door. 4 o'clock sharp. See you then. And that is the end of chapter 6. So we'll have to find out what happens next in chapter 7.